I know that most of you are very familiar with Love Living at Home, but I will just say a quick introduction for any of you who are not members or volunteers or maybe new to the LLH community. So Love Living at Home is a member-driven, non-for-profit organization that enables older adults to live vibrantly while aging in place. Members, volunteers, and staff work together to provide engaging educational and social programs and responsive support services to promote a strong, caring, connected community. We currently have about 205 members and about 101 volunteers. And in the past year, so in 2024, we offered over 500 programs and events and over 1,200 volunteer services. We do have individual memberships at about $43 per month, but we do have a special offer where we are offering a free 3-month trial. And if membership cost is a barrier from joining, we do have scholarships available after that trial. So I also would like to thank Dr. Dubovi and Dr. Costello. Dr. Ed Dubovi, for those of you that don't know, is a professor emeriti and former director of the Virology section at Animal Health Diagnostic Center at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell. Ed is a member and volunteers on our Finance and Operations Committee. And Dr. John Costello is a retired internist and Ithaca native. He graduated from Cornell and Johns Hopkins Medical School. He has practiced medicine in Ithaca for 35 years. John is a LLH member as well as a board member, and he volunteers on our programs committee, the executive committee, and he also hosts a monthly trivia Zoom event and our monthly play script reading on Zoom. So thank you very much to Dr. Costello and Dr. Dubovi, and Ed, I will let you get to the presentation.
Okay, if you can bring up that first slide.
Absolutely.
Somewhere hiding? Ah.
All right.
Okay. What we're going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about mainly is something called avian influenza virus, which I have here listed. It's for the birds. Now, avian influenza is in what's called a group A flu virus system. There are 3 others, just for completeness. There's an influenza B, which you should be able to recognize because it's also in your vaccines. Influenza A exists in at least 16 different types and in birds and 2 in bats. Flu B basically is restricted to humans, although there has been some spillover at one time or another into seals. Influenza C is mainly found in pigs, maybe some spillover. There's supposedly a human infection somewhere out there. And influenza D, most recent one, is been identified in cattle. Again, not any indication that there's significant concern about people. But what we're going to stick with is influenza A. Next slide. Okay, we're going to do a little background, getting in the weeds on nomenclature. So the common nomenclature for the group A flu virus is based on antigenic property of 2 specific proteins that sit on the surface of the virus. And I say antigenic. Antigens are things that if you inject into an animal makes an antibody response. If it makes no antibody response, it's not an antigen. So these 2 proteins are considered antigenic. They do make induce an antibody response in individuals if injected into it. The 2 main ones that sit on the surface of the virus are the hemagglutinin. Based on its name, you might suspect it mixed with certain red blood cells causes it to agglutinate into a clump. Commonly also referred to HA or simply H. As I said, there are 18 unique HAs currently known, and I say currently only because somebody will come up with 19 one of these days, and 16 are found on viruses. There are 2 that turned up in bats, something called H17N10 and H18N11. Their clinical significance is not really known. Suffice to say, though, that bats can be infected with the classic avian flus. There's been an H9 kicking around out there. The second protein that sits on the surface of the virus is called neuraminidase. Basically, it's an enzyme that chews away sugars. It's Na or N. So you have H5N1 is what we're going to be talking about. There are 11 unique ones out there. If you put the 18 HAs and the 11 Ns together, you can come up with about 198 different combinations. So flu does create some unique problems with regard to immunity and things to try and prevent it, because it does have a way of changing its form quite rapidly. Common names you'll see in the literature if you get into it. This one here happened to be one. A stands for the influenza A virus. The hemagglutinin in this case is classified as a type 3. The neuraminidase is a type 2. Again, we come into A. Perth was Australia where it was found. It was the 16th isolate you found in Australia at this time, and it happened to be coming out in the year 2019. So you may see some of those designations floating around in the literature if you get more into the weeds. Next slide. This is a schematic of a flu virus. The neuraminidase sits on the surface, so antibodies can be directed against it. The hemagglutinin, which is the real business end of this thing, is also on the surface in a trimer. This particular protein is one that attaches to cells. And so if you have a compatibility between this protein and a cell surface, it's sort of a lock and key issue. If the key is correct for the lock on the cell, then this virus particle will then be pulled into the cell, and the inner parts of this thing, which is where the business end of the virus is, really the nucleic acid, there are 8 unique gene segments buried inside this virus particle. Next slide, please. So the genome, the genetic coding capacity of the virus is about 13,500 nucleotides, individual A, G, TCs, arranged, as I said, in 8 unique segments. It circulates in nature, the A virus, flu A viruses, and they change by 2 different mechanisms. And it's somewhat the reason why we needed to have new vaccines every now and then. There's something called antigenic drift. If you think about somebody out there, a monk in his little cubicle, sitting there copying 13,500 letters, he may make a mistake every now and then. And depending on the mistake that's getting made, sometimes those mistakes are lethal, sometimes they're not. So if he's copying the word ball and happens to stick a U in there and get bull, that may change the sentence in such a way that it's nonsense, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it slightly changes it. So that's a mutation that could occur that might change the virus. If he happens to put a G in there and you get BGL, that's sort of a lethal mutation in a way, because it's nonsense. It makes no sense whatsoever. That particular protein then becomes non-functional. But that's what the drift is. It's these changes that occur as this virus replicates and tries to make copies of these 13,500 nucleotides. The bigger issue is what's called antigenic shift. And this occurs when 2 virus particles actually infect the same cell, which occurs rarely but can happen. And in that instance, we have 8 segments coming from one virus, 8 segments coming from another. And what can come out of that infected cell is 256 new viruses, or 254 if you eliminate the 2 that went in. So this is a major way that viruses really change over time because of this particular antigenic shift. And these shifts have occurred a couple of times in the virus history that we have. We've had the Hong Kong flu, Asian flu, which were major antigenic shifts that occurred, and we ended up with pandemics because of that. Your next slide, please. So as I said, there are 16 unique hemagglutinins naturally found in birds. Based on the ability to cause disease in birds, the flu A viruses were divided into two groups, low pathogenicity or LPAIs. These cause minor disease. And this is what you normally find in the bird populations that carry flu. And the birds that do it are dabbling ducks and shorebirds. And in these birds, the infection is an enteric one, so they're excreting virus constantly out into their environment, into the water that they inhabit. And just for the sake of curiosity, if influenza virus can survive for a month at 4 degrees in water. So it does have some ability to survive in the environment. So another bird swimming in the same pool could pick up the virus. But this is the normal that we find out in nature, these low pathogenicity viruses in the bird populations. So that's the vast majority. Every once in a while, we end up with a mutation that, or a recombination that occurs so that we have something called a high path virus, high mortality. Now you start seeing ducks dying, you start seeing geese dying, you start seeing any other birds that come in contact with this particular virus possibly dying. So we have high mortality rates. We have a lot of birds dying out there. Currently, I think the last thing I saw was 1,500 sandhill cranes died somewhere in the Midwest to the high path flu that we now have in the United States. So this is the nasty beast that's circulating currently in nature and causing very high mortality rates in virtually any of the birds it comes in contact with. The current HPI virus that we have in the United States has its origin somewhere around 1996, 97 in the Far East. And it did cause a major pandemic in the early 2000s. It did strike the US, and we did have very high mortality rates in birds and in chickens when it hit the production facilities. This virus went through some changes over time. Instead of an H5N1, it became an H5N6, it became an H5N9 by this recombination, this antigenic shuffling that I talked about, and then eventually reverted back to becoming an H5N1. And the particular clade that we have in the United States today seemed to have entered the wild bird populations in about 2021. Next slide. So you'll hear the word clade. A clade designation is the current one is something called 2.3.4.4b. And think of clades as a family tree. If you want to go back to your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and trace the genetic lineage of the family from there on, you've got uncles and cousins and second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins. And so think of a clade as the branches of a family tree. Now, what the clade determinations do is they don't give you fine analysis of the genetics of the makeup of the virus. So you could have a female individual about 5 generations from the original great-great-grandfather, but you couldn't tell whether or not, based on that, whether they had blue eyes, blonde hair, whatever. So we also have now something called genotypes. And so there are designations now out there that tells you whether that individual had blue eyes or blonde hair or whatever. Currently in the US, we have 2 genotypes circulating. And they're simply called B3.13 and D1.1. No, I have no idea where those numbers came from, but that's what we're left with right now. What's happened is that there's been massive die-offs of birds in the world based on this highly pathogenic H5N1 that's out there. And the most troubling thing that we have is the spillover into mammalian species. And as far as we know, there's been well over 40 mammalian species for which we have seen mortality. And most of these are sort of carnivores in that they feed on dead birds. So you have foxes, you have bears, you have big cats, you have the normal house cats, you have dogs, You also have skunks and possums and the like. Most recently, they've come up with even black rats in California being infected with one of these strains. So the danger then is the spillover. Now, most spillovers are sort of a one-off situation. A fox eats a dead bird, it gets the virus, and then the fox dies. It just doesn't pass it on. The concern becomes when this becomes now a mammalian transfer to another mammalian transfer, and then we start possibly having some serious problems. Next slide, please. So what's the big deal that we're talking about currently? The first event that triggered some concern in the US was in March when the genotype, the H5N1, showed up in a dairy cow in Texas. And when they started looking at the infection in cattle, because cows are certainly not a normal host for influenza viruses, what they found was there was a high concentration of the virus in the milk. But fortunately, there was a low amount of virus in the respiratory secretions, which is somewhat different. In birds, you find the virus being secreted in, growing in the intestine and secreted into the environment. Here in cattle, we're finding it being dumped into milk. So the milk supply becomes contaminated with very high concentrations of virus. There was a clear demonstration of cow-to-cow spread. So this was not a one-off. This was not a bird sitting on a cow and a cow picking up the infection. This now became a cow-to-cow spread. As best they could tell, this virus probably arose sometime in November, December of 2023, and was sort of moving through the cattle populations in somewhat of a silent infection, or an infection that wasn't creating any more mortality or morbidity in the cows than people normally see. Currently, this particular virus, the B313, has spread to at least 17 different states, with nearly 1,000 herds affected. And that's the 1,000 herds that have bothered to test. So we really don't know what this number looks like, the 1,000. The newer event occurred in Nevada, where the D1.1 actually ended up in cows, which was very different. The B313 is a recombinant with another avian flu virus, making it somewhat unique. And it's very different from the D1.1, but it's capable of infecting cows. Next slide, please. So the first human case linked to B313 was the virus in Texas in March of 2024. And the first human cases linked to D1.1 from cows was certainly, it was now in Nevada. At least 70 reported human cases have existed. Most of those have come from the B13 virus. 20 have been linked to the D1.1 from poultry. So poultry workers in the US are at risk for picking up the D1.1. Individuals working in the cattle populations are probably more susceptible to the B313. There's been one fatality associated with the D1.1, someone with very compromised health to begin with, and one really serious infection in Canada. There have been fewer than 5 detected D1.111s in cattle. Next slide. So what's the big deal? Most of the individuals infected with N5.1, it's certainly much higher than the reported cases. For most people infected with this particular strain of virus, it causes a very mild infection. Conjunctivitis is one of the normal signs associated with it, but it's not a really serious respiratory infection yet. So it's sort of the common cold. And unless you really have a high risk factor for picking up influenza, like you're working in a large chicken facility, you probably wouldn't get tested, so the infection may go undetectable. One of the big problems we have in the US is most dairies use labor from individuals who come from Mexico. Some are documented, some are not. But with the current hysteria we have over immigrants, the workers will not report health issue for fear of reprisal. So on one hand, the public health people really want to know what's going on. On the other hand, our current system of immigration is working against us really knowing what the true infection rate of flu is out there in the population. And the workers from Mexico aren't just in the Southwest. We have a large number of individuals working in the dairy industry in New York State from Mexico. It became a thing. Started in New Mexico with one dairy farm out there, and it became the model for working for dairy farms to recruit workers from Mexico to come in to work on our dairy farms. And so we have the dairy industry is really dependent on workers from Mexico. Next slide, please. So why haven't we stopped this infection? Number one, it's impossible to control wild bird populations. It just absolutely cannot do it. So migratory waterfowl are constantly shedding this virus into the environment. As I said before, I think flu can survive in a cold pond for a month. So if you have migrating birds coming into a pond, they can certainly pick up the infection and continue. So the migrating birds move these viruses from north to south every year. And so we have outbreaks of influenza depending on the migratory patterns that we have. What about the poultry world out there? Flu has been controlled to some extent in the poultry industry by strict biosecurity as best they can, keeping other birds out of their facilities. And for the last 25 years, the US government has had a policy where if you detect avian influenza virus in your flock, they will pay for the destruction of that flock, and then it will eventually get repopulated. So the infected flocks are destroyed. Vaccination has never been used in the US because of export issues. Other countries, immediately when we report a influenza virus in a commercial facility, whether it's egg laying or in meat production, they immediately shut off the export market. So somewhere between $2 and $5 billion worth of exports go down the drain when we report a influenza virus in a commercial facility. Now, the French have ignored this issue and have successfully vaccinated their ducks against the avian influenza virus, and they're not seeing any mortality rates associated with the ducks in their facilities that have been vaccinated. We have no poultry vaccines currently released in the US. They may exist, but again, because of this export restriction, they're not being used. The issue in cattle, number one, you have to recognize the USDA has absolutely no authority to control intrastate movement of animals. So if you have a cow in southern New York State and it's infected, or you want to move it to Buffalo area, it does so without any intervention or any restriction by the USDA for the movement of that animal intrastate. Animals moving intrastate do so with a health certificate and a negative flu test currently, but they're only testing lactating cows. So may or may not control the problem. And the rule actually got implemented about a month after the first infection. There was a sort of a desktop exercise in Texas one time where they had it was done with foot and mouth disease, but they said there was a foot and mouth disease positive cow at Texas A&M. And the question was, how many cows were exposed within the next 24, 48, and 72 hours? Within 72 hours, well over 19 states had cows that were in contact with the infected animals. So animals and cows move very rapidly around the US. So within this month before restriction of any movement, there were an awful lot of cows that moved around the country. The cattle industry, by and large, unlike the swine and bird businesses, essentially have ignored biosecurity measures for years. They're the sort of the cowboys of the food industry, and it's oh, you can't tell me what I can do with my animal type situations, and so biosecurity is not an issue. Plus, they've ended up with production systems where large numbers of calves move to a place where they get fattened up, and then they move back to the original farms. And so there's a lot of movement of cattle around the country, and a lot of reasons why the flu can move around with cows if they're not careful. Cattle vaccine was not developed until recently, but it's not been utilized yet. It's available, but the USDA has yet to authorize its use in cattle. And there's really economic disincentives to have a positive herd. The herd gets shut down, the milk is not able to be sold. And so the question becomes whether or not the farms are compensated sufficiently if they report a positive herd. Excuse me. The egg industry has a program in place where the USDA picks up the cost for the depopulation of the 20 million birds that may exist on somebody's property. So we haven't had flu in cattle long enough for any kind of a program to be developed to compensate the cattle owners. So things aren't moving very fast within that industry. These are some resources if you want to go look. Cornell has a website now in the veterinary college that will give you everything you need to know about highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. It's from simple things down to more esoteric topics. The CDC generally has a website up. God knows what it is these days, because the information out of the CDC is being highly restricted. So generally the CDC was a good source. It may not be such in the future. And then there's a group out of the University of Minnesota, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, CIDRAP. They're pretty much on top of what's going on out there in the flu world, and has a good website to go to if you want more information about this. So last slide. I always put this up there because this applies to virtually anything out there. We are living with simple lies, and nobody wants to deal with complex truths anymore. So that's where we are even within the infectious disease world. So thank you.
I'll add one comment. Something I read, Ed, is that when the chickens are infected, that there's roughly 90% mortality among the birds. So that's why they kill them all. And it's a horrible death. I think they gas them and save them the struggles.
Yeah, they have very special ways of, I've seen some of them where they use the devices where you see at airports where they want to keep a fire from going. They foam it. Well, they used to use a foaming device within these chicken houses, and the birds just suffocated to death.
Ugh.
Now, the USDA will compensate them for the birds they kill to stop an infection. They don't compensate them for the birds that die. So the producers are pretty quick to shut the houses down and kill the birds to get compensation for what's in there.
Well, there may be other questions for him at the end, but I'm going to talk some about epidemics, pandemics, flu, and then about how it pertains to people. But the thing that you should remember, since this is really the end of the flu season, although there's still cases, that if you're in the winter time and there's flu, COVID, or RSV going around, as there usually is most winters, that you get a fever, if you're in our group of people who are older or anybody who's younger at extra risk, you should be checked out very soon. If you're going to do something about the flu or COVID, it only helps to treat early. There's no medication for RSV. For the flu, you need to be taking one of the anti-flu medications within 48 hours. Otherwise, it doesn't really make a difference. If you take it within 48 hours, it only actually shortens the duration of the symptoms by about 1 day. But what you're doing is that you are decreasing the chances of serious complications. so that you're weakening it, and your body is also helping you fight it off. For COVID, you need to take the anti-COVID medication within 5 days. Otherwise, it doesn't really make a difference. So, and I will mention that again at the end, because nowadays you can test for these fairly simply, besides the home COVID tests that we have, which are pretty accurate. There's also a home flu test that tests for both A and B on the same swab that you can test for COVID. I think these tests are about $25 for two. In either case, if you have symptoms, you're having fevers, cough, bad sore throat, it's not just some minor illness there, you want to test yourself. And if you test negative, test again the next day. If it's the flu, you may not test positive on the first day, but most likely you will by the second. COVID, it may take more than 24 hours for you to test positive. For COVID, it also tends to come on more slowly as a general rule, but you ought to test again in 1 day and probably 2 days also before you'd be sure that you're negative. Now, if you're going to be seen by a physician or urgent care, they can do a test for COVID, RSV, and the flu. So you get those answers back from the lab within probably 24 hours. So the point is, with these viral illnesses, our antiviral medications make some difference. They shorten they lessen the severity of the illness, but they don't really knock it out. They just slow it down. So you ought to be seen early if you've got risk of serious infections. Looking back in history, epidemics are those things where there's excessive cases in a geographic area, and you wouldn't really call the outbreak in Texas an epidemic yet. There's no exact definition of that, but it's certainly a cluster that's occurring. When the epidemic spreads to multiple regions of a country or to different countries, like we've had with COVID in various times in history, that's a pandemic. The historically bad pandemics date back, as far as we know from records, to the 500s, the plague of Justinian, which was a Black Death. Again, this is a bacteria that is transmitted from rats and fleas, probably brought to the Mediterranean from further to the east. The historically Black Death plague of the mid-1300s in Europe killed 30 to 50% of Europe's population, usually horrible deaths. And that was over a period of about 4 years. Plague has not disappeared from the world. It is still, there's isolated cases, but thanks to sanitation and recognition, there's a simple antibiotic that you can take, cheap antibiotic that you can take that will deal with it, so that the few cases that pop up don't spread. Now, as far as the flu, the one that people remember most is the Spanish flu, 1918 to 1919, back in that time. It was probably infected World War I soldiers that brought it to the United States from Europe. The government here covered up the fact that we were having a lot of serious illness to begin with. And with that, the general response of governments whenever there is a serious epidemic going around throughout history is ignore it, then say that it's not happening, and finally reluctantly deal with it. So that the Spanish flu, it was called, only because the American press was urged not to report on it. So some Spanish reporters actually took up the cause and said, hey, look, this is happening. So that's how it got to be called Spanish flu. Now, about 1/3 of the world probably contracted it back then. Though there's been other times in history that, and by the way, each of those major pandemics, about 50 million people died. Obviously, way back in the 500s and the 1300s, there weren't that many people, so it was a much higher percentage. But in the 50 million died throughout the world in 1918 to 1919, Spanish flu. It was estimated that about 1/3 of the world contracted it. And that was one of the flu episodes in which younger people tended to be more affected. And it's probably because as you get older, you've lived through some other flus and you have some resistance from prior immunity. And that's occurred other times in history, although you're also at more risk of having a serious complication just because you're older, so that even a bad cold makes you stumble on the way to the bathroom, you fall down, you break your hip, one thing leads to another, etc. So other times in history, there have been lesser episodes. There have been smallpox over various times, cholera, Russian flu, other plague. Even in Asia, actually 10 million died around 1900, plus or minus about 15 years. We don't hear about some of those if they occur far from us. So the Asian flu, which Ed mentioned, 1957 to 1958, killed about 11 million people worldwide. It was first detected in Asia. It was another one in which the young tended to suffer more. That was an H2N2, which was linked with birds. The Hong Kong flu in 1968 was an H3N2, also linked to birds, carried back to the United States, probably from Vietnam veterans. About 1 million died worldwide, about 34,000 in the United States. The flu in general in the United States, affects usually millions. There's anywhere from around 20 to 80,000 people that die from the flu. Mainly, they have other serious health problems in which that's enough to tip them over, but some people get serious illness from it. And we should learn from also 1976, the swine flu scare. And if you're like me, you probably also had a vaccination then. And the difficulty with these possible epidemics, possible pandemics, and the whole question about H5N1 and the bird flu is it going to jump to humans? Is it going to be really serious? Shouldn't we prepare ahead of time for it? Should we alarm people unnecessarily? Should we alarm them by stockpiling lots of vaccine? Should we urge them to all check their immunization status and get whatever vaccine that then may come out? And there are some vaccines, by the way, that the U.S. does have stockpiles of for this H5N1. They're not releasing any of it, but they do have it. So with the swine flu, it turned out not to be so pathogenic after all. It had been noticed in some Army recruits in New Jersey or so. But there was a big discussion back and forth over about a year's time, and the vaccination was manufactured, and then it was urged on people. And since the disease turned out not to be very serious, it was mild, the vaccinations side effects, which were rare, but there were some serious neurologic side effects, scared people so much that the vaccination program came to a halt, and it's given a bad name to infectious disease practitioners and governments for pushing the vaccine, perhaps unnecessarily. On the other hand, if they hadn't stockpiled it and started to vaccinate people, they might have run into a terrible pandemic. So there's always some tension about this. And we saw the same thing with COVID. As the vaccine came out, it really did help a lot. But then there's occasional rare side effects to it. People got turned off by that. People got turned off by having the vaccine being required, masks being required, etc. All those things are common in history. There have been anti-vaccination protests against smallpox vaccination going back throughout history. And one reason why smallpox vaccination got to be prevalent in Europe was when the wife of a British diplomat came back from Turkey, where she noticed that the people there were not all had scarred faces from smallpox, and found out that it was because they'd been inoculating themselves with small amounts of smallpox for years, a technique that had been picked up from the Chinese centuries before that. Brought it back to England, and one of the royal family chose to have their children also be vaccinated. Similarly, in the United States, there is a practitioner that helped popularize the smallpox vaccination and inoculated his 4 children as well, showing that he was willing to take the chance. So, talking again about epidemics, pandemics, as Ed pointed out, all this kind of recombination that can occur might trigger a pandemic, and you never know when that may occur. It needs to be watched carefully. It is watched in other places around the world as well. So in addition to the CDC, there are state health departments and local health departments that do continue to track these things. They may not have CDC putting them all together in reports until they're, quotes, vetted by the administration. But there is some ongoing surveillance of these things that's occurring anyway. COVID, by the way, ended up killing an estimated about 7 million people around the world, of which 1.2 million were in the United States. That's the highest in the world, but we really keep better records. The numbers that died in other places, no doubt, were much higher. The AIDS epidemic so far has killed about 32 million people. That's over a period of about 40 years. So, in talking about individual treatments, back in 1918, to go back to the Spanish flu, they thought at the time it was bacterial. They only vaguely knew about some filterable particles, and no one had the means to show that it was due to a virus there. So that people tried various things back then, very similar to what people treated their COVID with at first. People tried for the Spanish flu. They gave various pills, laxatives, syrups, malts, wine, cherry tree bark, and advertised them as, quotes, nothing better to ward off Spanish influenza, end quotes. They even had a screen with a silver handle on it to put between lovers' lips. It was an ozone generator that supposedly killed the passage of virus between the kissers' lips. The Federal Trade Commission had only opened a couple of years before, and they weren't keeping very close track on any of these claims. They even had some music that was, quote, specially formulated frequency to boost your immune system and weaken the virus, end quotes. So there's always going to be cures like that that will be touted, no matter how, quote, sophisticated we are. So the current flu vaccines are this year trivalent, and they pick these vaccines basically on what's been circulating in other parts of the world, the Southern Hemisphere for one thing, and partly in China. And somewhere people put their heads together, Ed may know about this, and then decide months ahead of time about what should be in the vaccine for that year. And it's really a best guess about what's going to be occurring. It matches what actually is circulating maybe about half or more of the time. The problem is only 40% of adults get the vaccine in the United States. About 70% of people over 65 do get the vaccine. And the vaccine is not 100% successful, obviously. The antigenic drift and shifts that are occurring with the virus means that it may not be completely protective, but still it tends to be pretty good protection against serious illness. It really decreases your chances if you're hospitalized of not being bad enough that you're in intensive care. It decreases those chances by about 60%. It's estimated, so that you may still get ill, but you're less likely to die from it. There are medications for it. There's one that's been around for about 15 years, oseltamivir. It's one that it's a pill you take for about 5 days, and it tends to shorten the symptoms by about 1 day, but again, shorten the chances of having serious illnesses. There's one now which is called baloxavir. It's just one pill, one time. It's a little bit more expensive, though. For people that can't tolerate by mouth, there are some that are, there is one by intravenous, but you'd need to be sick enough to be in the hospital for that. And each of those do make some difference. By the way, it's expected that the bird flu that's circulating would be responsive to these medications. I don't know how they know that, but that's what I've read. Again, it's important to test quickly. They're not going to make much difference if you take them beyond 48 hours of onset of symptoms. The flu generally hits you hard within about 12 hours. You wake up in the morning, you're feeling okay. Mid-afternoon, you're not feeling so good. Evening, you're really feeling sick. You're starting to get fever, high fevers, very achy. You're starting to have a cough. COVID, as a general rule, comes on more slowly. It's not a hard and fast rule, but you'd still need to test in order to be sure. And again, our tests are pretty good. If you're just at the start of the flu season and you do a test for flu and it turns out to be positive, the chances are about 50-50 that it's actually a false positive, because there's not much going around. The false positives are very small, but the predictive value of it is poor. Once you're into the flu season, you don't really need to it used to be that you didn't need to do the test. You just would treat as though it's the flu. But now we know that we have RSV and coronavirus circulating, and you can do the test to distinguish each of them. So that, again, you want to check to test early. False positives are very unlikely. You should just treat people. The problems of treating people are very small, an upset stomach or whatever. I'll just take a moment to mention about COVID then. It is still circulating. It is starting to fade again. The treatment there needs to be taken before day 5. You can read things that the current strains that are circulating in the past year or so are milder, and that seems to certainly be the case. And that studies show that taking the anti-COVID medications don't really make a difference with this strain. That's true for otherwise healthy people. It is not true for people that are immunocompromised or people in our age group. You should still seek out testing, treatment, and take it, you're likely to benefit from it. There is hope, by the way, for flu, and it's in trials for a one-size-fits-all flu vaccine that incorporates several different antigens or particular ones that are particularly conserved. Anthony Fauci spent about 40 years working on that idea, and it still hasn't come to pass. But I have read that there are trials that either have started or are soon to start, which people are hopeful about, that might give us more protection and maybe longer lasting protection. And the last thing about vaccines that I'll mention is it's still partly an art and not a science. We do know that if people get an illness like the flu or measles, one of the other viruses, that you tend to get lifelong protection from it. The reason is probably because you have so much of the virus and its antigens that are being presented in your body that your immune system is able to make some strong response to it, and it has to do with the number of particles on the outside of a cell and whether they can be cross-linked, etc. So that if you have the illness itself, you tend to get lifelong protection from that particular virus or some bacteria. So the strain may be somewhat different. You maybe get some partial protection from it. The flu vaccines that are usually used are broken up pieces of the outer coat of the virus. That doesn't give us as much a presentation to our immune system, so that the immunity to it is shorter lived. In fact, it's actually about 4 months or so to the flu that you have a pretty good antibody response, just as it is to COVID. And there have been some infectious disease experts that have for years said that, for people that are really at risk, they should probably get a booster 4 months after their first shot. The government won't pay for it. Your insurance may not pay for it, but it's what, $30 or so. So you can keep that in mind. People at greater risk, that's a reasonable thing to consider. It is not any government policy ever, because it would be very difficult to organize, not only for people to come in and get their shots in the fall, but to come back in later. And there's no study that shows that that actually is beneficial. It's just, in theory, not an unreasonable thing to do. So with that, I would be glad to take any questions, and Ed also. I may not be able to see everybody that's asking a question, so if Leslie or Dina can point them out.
I see Rob Hillman.
Yes. First, thank you both for a very informative presentation. One thing that I wonder about is, and I think I direct the question to both of you, is in light of what Ed was saying about all of the ways that the viruses change and replicate, how does a one-size-fit-all vaccine deal with something like that? It would seem to me that it wouldn't last very long before there were changes in the virus.
Well, the COVID virus, remember, has kept mutating, and yet the vaccines are still helpful because they're targeting a part of the virus, in this case, 2 parts of it, that are pretty well conserved. There's the spike protein changes, other thing changes, but there's parts of it that still seem to remain in its core. And I don't know what those parts in the influenza virus are. There's the H and the N that tend to be well conserved also, but people have found some other I don't know what they are, but they're hoping to make the vaccines work for that reason.
Yeah, you're basically going to try and shoot for something that doesn't change from strain to strain. I know that both H, A, and N anchored to the surface with a stock area, and they've tried to direct some antibodies against that because those are highly conserved areas on all the viruses. And so if you could come up with some magic bullet that looks at a region that rarely changes, then that's what they're going to go for. It's a difficult one. The strongest immunity you get is against the surface antigens that you see out there, but then you're running into the problem of they can change on a month-to-month basis if you're unlucky.
I see Joe's hand up, Joe Regenstein.
Thank you. Just wanted to make a quick comment on Ed's discussing towards the end of his talk about depopulation of animals. That's an area where in the past there hasn't always been as much research, but the American Veterinary Medical Association has put together a panel to look at depopulation methods and now has a guideline so that there is work to try to do the best animal welfare in the context of having to do large depopulations. I just wanted to mention that as there is effort to try to do it in as humane a way as possible for the animals.
Yeah, one of the problems we have in the US is somewhat too big to succeed issues. Some of our avian facilities are upwards of 20 million birds. The comment has been made that if we actually had 10 facilities with only 2 million birds in it, that we may only have to depopulate maybe 2-4 million birds as opposed to the 20 if they were in smaller units. So there's some issue about how our very, very efficient production systems are now led to the having to destroy 20, 30 million birds on one facility when flu does hit it. So it's our success in one area is leading to some real problems in another one.
By the way, I'll be giving a little update about measles at current events tomorrow at the beginning of the time.
Aren't we all so old that we got it as kids?
We'll talk about that. Basically, you don't need to worry. Our age doesn't worry about checking their titers.
Can I ask a quick question? I don't want to put either of you on the spot, but what are your predictions about avian flu?
Beats me.
Yeah, that's about it. If the mutation rate with flu is fairly high, and it depends, what context it finds itself. I won't say by random choice, but it's that. And the key for, I think, us is to stop this spread from mammal to mammal. The one-off infections usually don't generate anything. So a fox eats a dead bird and gets flu and dies. No big deal. When we start congregating animals like we do with cattle, with pigs and chickens, now we have the ability for this virus to hit one species and move rapidly on to the next. And in that rapid transfers, you end up with the possibilities of something very different coming out than you went in with. So the key as far as I'm concerned is they need to stop these infections in cattle now and not dink around with it. The USDA did, as I say, put an order in December that all bulk milk must be tested. And that's a pretty sensitive test. And that will hopefully identify positive herds. But I hate to say it, we're dealing with a bunch of cowboys in the cattle industry, and there are a lot of those "it's my cows, damn well don't you tell me what I can do with them" attitudes out there, particularly in the small herds, the 20, 30, 40 feeder cow operations, which run on, number one, they run on cash, so they're avoiding income taxes. And number two, they don't want to take anybody's advice. So the question will be, how can we stop this in cows before somebody who's managing cows picks up something really nasty and starts a real pandemic? But we got to stop the animal-to-animal spread, period.
Yeah, the cases so far, that just 2 serious cases. It's usually mild.
Yeah.
I see Margot Graff has her hand up. Can you unmute yourself, Margot?
There should be a little microphone icon on the bottom left.
There you go.
The new current administration in the government, how big of an impact do you think that that is going to have on these various agencies, health agencies that are doing so much work to help us understand what's going on and to protect us? Do you think it's going to have a very large effect? It doesn't sound like they're getting rid of so many agencies and so many people who do this kind of work, and it's scary.
It is scary, although there's state and local health departments that are still supported and unfettered in some states anyway. But if this all blows up in the government's face, it will be a huge problem.
Meaning, the
Well,
government will not get away with it.
unrecognized epidemics that again, if you remember Trump saying early on with the COVID, after about a month and cases are being reported, his response was, quit testing. That'll be the problem.
Quit or quick?
Quit testing. Stop testing.
Yeah.
So if you don't test, you don't have disease. That's the theory behind that mentality. And it's pervading the system already because the CDC has been somewhat gutted in its epidemiology groups. Massive amounts of databases have been deleted from the files so that people don't have access to current information. And it's, the response to the poultry industry now is, oh, give them another $500 million for biosecurity and maybe think about it. Moderna had a contract for a flu vaccine that they're trying to review and stop. So it's a stick your head in the sand type issue and hope it goes away. We may not see that. New York State has had a very aggressive public health department, and let's hope that they continue to do the job that they've done in the past. And they're probably second to the CDC in terms of the quality of their public health system.
Thank you.
So if you want to live, move to New York State.
Nancy Seaman?
Yes, I just wanted to ask, we noticed dead ducks and cormorant last summer on Lake Ontario. So is bird flu in New York State?
It's absolutely here. I say it came into the US in 2021, but there have been now reports of dead snow geese on, I think, Cayuga Lake, maybe on the Seneca Lake. There have been reports of dead raptors around the state. As I say, the problem there is that with hawks and even eagles that eat a dead bird, they then pick up the flu. So the virus does exist in the state. There's just nothing you can do about it because we do have the migrating ducks and coming through the system. So there's been some minor reports in commercial facilities, but none of the big poultry producers in the state, I don't think, have been hit yet. But it's certainly out there. And the public health people, I know some of the wildlife people who've been told if you see a dead bird lying around to triple bag it and just throw it in the garbage, which is probably okay. But if you have any questions, I suppose call the local health department how to get rid of it. But you want to get rid of it because we're having problems with a lot of cats who are dying of these influenzas because they will eat this stuff. Cat food is made out of raw poultry, and people who believe in feeding raw things to cats are killing their cats, feeding them these infected poultry products. Raw milk is another place where they may be able to pick it up, but it's certainly out there, and New York's has not escaped it. I haven't heard of any dairy in the state yet being positive, but there've been some minor bird issues out there, certainly. So it's there. You see a dead bird, don't go pick it up with your hands.
Yeah, thank you.
It's not Deb Schmidley, but that's the name. You can unmute yourself, dear. Yeah.
It's a less significant other. Tim, a question for each of you. One, in terms of avian flu, any precautions in terms of bird feeders, either seed or suet? And then for Dr. Costello, any comments in terms of continuing to wear masks in crowded settings in terms of COVID
Go ahead first, Ed.
and the flu?
I haven't seen anything regarding sort of songbirds associated. Where you're going to have the problem is those populations of birds where they actually congregate. Now we have starlings coming through now in huge flocks, but I don't think the bird feeders per se are a high risk factor at this point in time. I just haven't seen any information on, like I say, somebody. But again, a cardinal flying off into the bush and dying, the odds of finding it are about zero. So it could be happening rarely, but it's not a risk factor such as those birds would have a tendency to congregate and flock together.
Thank you.
As far as masks, it's not unreasonable to keep wearing masks actually throughout any winter in which viruses are going around in crowded areas. I wear a mask at my chorus practice still, mostly to protect anybody that would be around me, because there is a 3.5-year-old and a 11-month-old in the house, and the 3.5-year-old is in daycare, and you never know when he's just picked up something that week that I don't have any symptoms from, because COVID, you might communicate for a few days before you get any symptoms. But I will tend to sit in the back of a room if there is some meeting going on, or I'll wear a mask. So it's up to the individual. I see very few people wearing masks. I was just at the Science Center with a 3-year-old, and the 2 people at the desk wore masks. I put on a mask, and the 3-year-old actually kept his on. I wouldn't have bothered to put it on, except that his parents wanted me to have him keep his mask on. So, but I wasn't close enough to anybody for any time. But close in conversations in small rooms, discussions, choir practices, those are all things that respiratory illnesses still can be transmitted. You're not so likely to transmit flu because you get sick so early and you know not to go out. COVID, at least at the beginning, it was a much slower onset of disease, and that you could communicate it for several days before you got symptoms. Nobody has really tracked whether that slower period of transmission is occurring, and I've been looking for articles but haven't seen anything. I don't know about RSV, but there are whole countries like I think Japan, they tend to wear masks in the wintertime.
What about restaurants? I talk to people who are going out to eat all of the time, during the winter, you know, not the outdoor cafes, but indoors. And I haven't been doing it. However, I'm wondering whether I really should start at this point yet.
It's a small risk.
Small.
Yeah. I mean, most of the people that are out eating are not coughing and sneezing.
Ah, I see. Exactly. Yep. Makes sense. Unless a crowded time at a, you know, if the restaurant isn't too terribly crowded, that helps.
It's like don't go to a crowded restaurant. It's too popular.
Yep, and populated.
You're muted.
Now I forgot what I was going to ask. It'll come back to me.
And if anyone does have further questions, they can also pass them along to the office. Oh, it looks like Nina does have a question.
In response to the restaurant question, I heard something on the news now, just this afternoon, that over 70% of restaurant meals are now consumed through takeout. So people aren't going to restaurants as much as they did before COVID. They are avoiding it. But one question I have is, has the flu been more prevalent this winter in some parts of the country than others?
I don't know, but I'm sure that's the case. But this flu season was a bit harder than recent ones. People were masking more, for one thing, in the last couple of years, and also people didn't congregate as much.
Thank you.
There are a number of gatherings, love living at home gatherings, etc., where they're serving drinks or hors d'oeuvres. I think it still makes sense to wear a mask to these events, and it's up to the person whether they feel free to have an hors d'oeuvre. I think what you are saying is that in the winter, we just need to be continuing to be masked up. I know at Green Star, I see more people than I do at some of the other grocery stores do wear masks. And they do provide a reasonable amount, I think, of protection. It's better to wear one than not to. But going to people's homes for you know, get-togethers, if it's family, that's one thing. You might know who has it and who doesn't, or you might not know. How I think I'm getting from what I read that we should keep being quite careful. And in the
Our
summer,
age group should be. Yeah.
yes, exactly. And in the summer, I mean, you still could find yourself, unless people have open wide windows, you still could find yourself in an establishment where you could pick it up, but it's just not as much of a threat in the summer as it is now. I think that's the going opinion.
Yes, I mean, COVID was communicated pretty much year round. It had some dips in warmer weather, but it was still circulating. Flu, and I don't know that anybody has the answer to this. Ed might know something, but flu tends to be in the winter time when the windows are closed, etc. And I know the idea was floated a long time ago that it has something to do with atmospheric conditions, but maybe it has to do with migration. I don't know. Maybe Ed has an idea.
No, I haven't a clue. I mean, there's certain aerobiology experiments that show certain viruses survive better at different relative humidities. But that doesn't quite explain the winter issue. It's always been assuming that we happen to congregate more in the winter, so the probability of something like this happening, and maybe because of the lack of humidity in some places, if it's overheated, you do have more opportunity for cracks in the defense systems of your upper respiratory tract that viruses maybe get into. But the answer certainly isn't out there as any great reliance on any good answer about it.
Yeah, but anybody, eating in a restaurant or going to meetings, having a birthday party, we all make the unknowing, maybe you don't think about it, but you're making a decision about whether to wear a mask or not. So
Exactly.
risk is lower.
I would just like to thank both John and Edward for taking the time to prepare this and answering all of our questions so patiently.
Well, we should probably do it next year in September or October. Somebody suggested, Betsy, I think you suggested it now. It is the tail end of the flu season, so keep it in mind for the future. And there'll be more about bird flu, I'm sure.
Yeah, and we have such experts in our membership that we are happy to take advantage of you. So thank you for letting us take advantage of you.
I always learn something in going over things again.
Well, thank you so much, Ed and John, and thank you all for attending. Have a wonderful afternoon.